During the Cold War, our NATO allies fielded large and capable militaries that were absolutely essential to the successful Allied deterrence of Soviet aggression in Europe. Germany alone fielded a military with 500,000 military personnel, with 12 heavy tank divisions providing the backbone of NATO's conventional force in Europe. Strong European leaders like Konrad Adenauer, Margaret Thatcher, and Charles de Gaulle built some of the best militaries in the world and understood the need to field a force that was credible to deter Warsaw Pact aggression. The combination of a large and qualitatively superior conventional force in Europe and a robust American nuclear arsenal in theater proved successful, and the Soviets never attempted an attack on a NATO member. When the Cold War ended, many believed it was the end of history, and defense budgets plummeted across the alliance. The United States has underwritten the security of Europe throughout this period, as many European countries have preferred to spend money on lavish social welfare programs and climate change spending. Unfortunately, some of the wealthiest countries in Europe have not sufficiently increased military spending, even since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, with much of Western Europe content to let the United States, Poland, and the Baltic states take the lead in fielding the force necessary to deter Russian aggression. This needs to change. Europeans must take primary responsibility for their own security, so that America can focus on the far bigger challenge to American and world security posed by China in the Indo-Pacific. NATO has been one of the most successful alliances in history. The unified efforts of its members ensured the Cold War never became hot. NATO can be restored if all member states are willing to do what's necessary once more to deter aggression against the alliance, by fielding a force strong enough that Russia is never tempted to launch an attack on one of its members. The United States remains committed to NATO and the defense of Europe. One hopes that Europe does as well.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Director of the Heritage Foundation's Allison Center for National Security, Robert Greenway.
Well, good morning to everyone. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation, the first public event in our new space. We're delighted to have you all here today and successfully navigating the traffic from the NATO summit, which brings us, of course, to the purpose of today's event. NATO is convening, as you all know, on the occasion of its 75th anniversary here in Washington, where it was founded. The alliance's commitment to European security helped defeat the Soviet Union, and for too long, though, has neglected its defenses and invited Russian aggression. It's not our grandfather's NATO. NATO prevailed against the Warsaw Pact by taking its defense seriously, dedicating the required resources. Ironically, the victors neglected their defense, and the lack of commitment invited aggression and now risks European security. Putin's naked aggression serves as a wake-up call to exceed minimum defense spending and restore European security without placing the burden entirely upon the American taxpayer. NATO's population and economic power eclipses Russia's and should be applied towards collective security to restore and maintain effective deterrence. NATO's population, Poland, the Baltic states, and Scandinavian nations are leading the way. The rest of NATO must follow. The Biden administration's flawed policies, poor execution, and weakness has contributed to the most dangerous security environment since the end of the Cold War. The alliance our grandfathers built won the Cold War, built the inheritance that we now have, but it's time to reclaim that vision and win the new Cold War. We're delighted today to be joined by some of the brightest minds in the conservative movement, some of the best minds the nation has in defense, national security, and foreign policy today. I'll introduce them. We'll have 30 minutes of question and answer with them, and then we'll invite the audience and those online joining us today for their questions as well. As I introduce, and once complete, we'll then take our seats. Elbridge Colby is founder and principal of the Marathon Initiative, a policy initiative institute focused on developing strategies to prepare the United States for an era of sustained great power competition. He's the author of Strategy for Denial, American Defense in the Age of Great Power Conflict. And the Wall Street Journal selected him as one of the top 10 books of 2021. Earlier in his career, Bridge served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy and Force Development from 2017 to 18, and in that role, he authored the President's National Defense Strategy, shifting our focus to the Indo-Pacific. He's the recipient of Distinguished and Exceptional Public Service Awards from the Department of Defense, Superior Meritorious Honor Awards from the Department of State, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, graduate of Harvard and Yale. Dr. Niall Gardner is the director from the Margaret Thatcher Center for Freedom at the Heritage Foundation. Before joining Heritage, Dr. Gardner served as foreign policy aide to Lady Thatcher in her private office in London, assisting her with her book, Statecraft Strategies for a Changing World, and advising her on a number of international issues. Dr. Gardner is a prominent expert on U.S.-British relations, U.S. and British foreign policy, and transatlantic alliance. He received his master's in philosophy, his PhD degrees from history from Yale, a BA and MA in modern history from Oxford. He's testified several times before the United States Congress on foreign policy issues and is a foreign policy advisor to 3 U.S. presidential candidates. He's provided analysis on global events, the U.S. and international television networks, including Fox, CNN, MSNBC, CNBC, Fox Business Networks, BBC, and others. Wilson Beaver is Senior Policy Advisor for Defense Budgeting at the Heritage Foundation, Allison Center for National Security, and in this role, he's responsible for assessing the adequacy, composition, and character of the U.S. defense budget, associated policies, and supports the center's mission to promote a strong U.S. national defense. Before joining Heritage in 2023, he worked as a policy advisor on the Senate Small Business Committee for Ranking Member Paul. Prior to that, he served as a non-commissioned officer and team leader in the U.S. Army. During his time, he served as a paratrooper in the 173rd Infantry Airborne Brigade Combat Team in Vicenza, Italy. Perhaps that was your footage we saw earlier. And on deployment to Iraq as part of Operation Inherent Resolve. Please join me in welcoming our panelists. Brage, one of our pieces out this week by Bob Peters addresses the need for Europeans to have a credible military that can deter, ultimately defeat Russian aggression. In your judgment, what's the biggest obstacle Europe has in taking the lead for the conventional burden in Europe?
Well, great. Well, thanks, Rob. And let me just say how much of a pleasure and an honor it is to be here at the Heritage Foundation with all of you, and also mentioning people like Bob Peters, how important your work is, not only in the conservative movement, as important as that is, but in the nation at large, and really charting a way forward on foreign policy and defense policy in such an important way, rethinking in a way that's consistent with conservative principles. So it's really a privilege and an honor to be here with you all. And I know this is the inauguration of this room, so it's a special privilege to be here. Look, I think we're here during the NATO summit, which is kicking off today, and I think the montage that we just saw really captured it. What's the biggest obstacle? I think it's probably a perception of need on the part of the Europeans. I was talking to a European radio station earlier today. I actually don't fault the Europeans. This is not about laying all the fault at the feet of the Europeans. In some ways, this is our own fault, or at least that of our foreign policy establishment. But where I really think we need to focus now is on the practicalities and the fact that, as Wilson has written very eloquently about, the defense strategy that the Trump administration put out, that I had the honor of working on, that the Biden administration has put out. We don't have a multi-theater military. Our defense industry is not in good shape, and it's not getting fixed. In fact, it may be getting worse, actually, especially because it's being heavily depleted and sort of taxed upon. We're not meeting our readiness goals, et cetera. Rob, you know this very, very well and have spoken about this eloquently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is not kind of wearing the hair shirt. But my view is, to kind of put a fine point on it, is, are we doing Europeans any favors by promising them more than we can deliver? I think that's a hallmark of President Biden's administration, is promising more than we can deliver. But that gives you a short sugar high for the Europeans. But I think the best way to be an ally to the Europeans is to say, hey, look, I think NATO's really important. But NATO can't survive unless, and the only quibble I would have with the title of this panel is I think actually we're going back to more like what our grandfather's NATO would be, which is when the Europeans had strong militaries. It's probably not our father's military, depending on how old you are out there. But I think it's totally plausible. And in fact, what I would say is I see actually Europeans going through the stages of grief, and frankly, our foreign policy establishment maybe even behind them. But I find, don't take it from me, Minister of Defense Pistorius in Germany, the Polish government, the Minister of Defense Healy in the United Kingdom, the Finnish government, the Romanians are spending 2.5%. People are getting it. So that's the basis for a new common sense approach to NATO. This is not some radical idea that Americans are going to spend 3.5%, and yeah, Europeans are going to spend a bit more too, and let's get serious about it. What's the output in terms of combat forces? Because as you pointed out, Rob, the Russians actually are a threat. I think they are. They're not the Red Army of 1945, but they're not a joke either. So, okay, So let's get serious about this in a way that's realistic and credible.
Couldn't agree more. And now you just came back from the continent, from the UK, where elections were held in both locations. In your judgment, is the political situation an obstacle, an impediment, or is it an accelerant to the issues and the requirement that Bridge just outlined?
Well, thanks very much for having us here today at such a critically important time, I think, for the future of the NATO alliance. I was just in London last week. Big political changes in the UK. Also, of course, we saw crucial elections in France over the weekend. And I think that with regard to the changes that we're seeing, so France, firstly, actually, I'm very concerned about the direction which France is taking. And you now have a left-wing coalition as the largest single bloc in the French parliament. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, former Trotskyist, may still be a Trotskyist, in fact, could be the next Prime Minister of France. And he's spoken about the possibility of France leaving NATO. And so I'm concerned about the developments in France, really at the very heart of Europe, the growing influence of the far left in French politics. The left in France, of course, is extremely anti-NATO. They're against the transatlantic alliance, anti-American. And so what we're seeing in France right now is a very dangerous development, I think, potentially for the future of the NATO alliance. And Emmanuel Macron, in a way, has sort of gifted a great deal of political control now to the far left, and he struck a deal with the left as well in the election. I think that's a dangerous path. In the UK, after 14 years of Conservative rule, we now have a socialist government in power. So far, the new government headed by Keir Starmer is sending the right messages with regard to NATO and the transatlantic alliance. But we need to see from the new British government a firm commitment to increase defence spending right now. David Lammy, the new Foreign Secretary, is going to be urging all NATO members to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP. That's a very positive message, but let's see a clear commitment from the new British government to increase British defence spending right now to 2.5% of GDP. And at the end of the day, I think British leadership in Europe is critically important, is vital. And the UK has to take a very, very strong lead in support of increased defence spending, in support of a stronger NATO alliance. But I do have a lot of concerns about the big picture with regard to the new socialist government in the UK. It's a new course for the UK away from conservative leadership over the past 14 years. So I think there are significant risks there for Britain. But let's see what the messaging is at the NATO summit this week from the UK, France, from Germany, from all of the big European powers. Just one final note on Germany. We're going to have elections next year. I think that Olaf Scholz's socialist government has been very weak in many respects. If the CDU takes over, I think you'll have far more robust leadership in support of the NATO alliance coming from Germany. So elections do matter in Europe, and they're highly consequential.
Appreciate that very much now. So if the jury's out, and as Bridge suggests, the threat is pressing and real, and our commitment of resources has been heretofore inadequate on both sides of the Atlantic, Wilson, in your judgment, is what we're asking realistic? And how does defense spending compare over time?
It's very realistic. It's perfectly feasible. You look back at the Cold War, European NATO members were fielding very large, very capable militaries. At its height, the German military had 500,000 men under arms, several hundred thousand more than what it has today. The average for European NATO defense spending in 1985 was 3.1%. The United States was around 6 at the time, but 3.1% is very substantial. Now, in 2022, right before the Ukraine invasion, it was at 1.7%. And that's a little bit up from the 1.3 or even lower that it was following the Cold War. It's perfectly feasible, and as Bridge has written about and talked about extensively, it's necessary. France by itself has a larger GDP than Russia. Meanwhile, China's economy is roughly 2/3 that of the United States', which makes it a far larger economy with far more resources than the Soviet Union ever had. The United States needs to focus on the Indo-Pacific, And so we need our European allies to step up, and they're perfectly capable of it.
Yeah, I think the contrast is stark, right? Since 1955, as yours and Bob's research shows, NATO's economy has grown by $40 trillion, and yet defense spending is roughly half in the same time frame. Population has grown by over 490 million, starting with 12 members now at 32, and yet we're 6 million less men under arms. I think the gap is obviously debilitating. So, Bridge, if we're agreed that the requirement is pressing, that it's feasible, in your judgment, how long will it take? What is a realistic timeline in terms of expectation, assuming everyone agreed that we need to increase our commitment?
So I think this is the nub of the problem, and this is where I would urge the conversation to go. I don't think we're getting it necessarily from the public messaging from the summit. I do think there's some progress. General Cavoli, for instance, some of the planning that appears to be going on within the alliance is constructive. So there is forward movement. I think this is an important point to stress because there are people actually on both sort of the extremes, I would say, of this issue. On the one side, people who say the U.S. has to do everything in NATO because the allies can't tie their own shoes. And then there's the sort of isolationist argument, which is the allies will never do anything, so we just have to give up. It's not worth it. And actually, I think what we're seeing is both historical record shows that Europe can do a lot, A, and B, that what's happening in the last couple of years is, partially President Trump really bringing this issue far more to the forefront, but of course Putin's invasion and so forth. There is actual progress. So the problem, I would say, is timelines and the pace and scale of the buildup. And here's the nub of the problem, which is, as Wilson rightly says, China's must be the priority. The only thing I would quibble with is 2/3 is using nominal GDP figures. If you look at like electricity consumption, apparently China uses something like double the electricity of the United States. It's a much larger industrial power. So, if you're looking at it more in a military or geopolitical context, by some measures, China may be a larger economy than the United States. Whatever, people have different views. It's similar order of magnitude. That's clearly what's going on. And then we know without question that China is preparing for a confrontation. Don't take that from me. Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall, who deserves a lot of credit over a decade for bringing these issues. I think he's really been a huge positive force on these issues. He's pointed out China's preparing for war. And just because Kirk Campbell or Avril Haines says that they don't think that Xi Jinping is going to move, that doesn't give me any comfort because I don't think there's any rational evidentiary basis that they could have for that confidence. So we have to be prepared. And that could happen basically at any time. Now, I guess the best military assessments suggest the PLA is not quite as confident as it might be, but we really don't know that. And that could change very quickly. So I think whoever's elected in November, in the next 4 years, whatever presidential administration, I hope it's President Trump, you've got to be ready for a Chinese attack on Taiwan in the first island chain. And that means we don't have the luxury of time. And I think the effect of the Biden administration's policy towards NATO is basically, hey, we'll have this gradual, very seamless transition. It's like, no. That's not how it is. It means like right now, and there are capabilities, and I'd commend to everybody's attention a really superb paper by Camille Grand of the European Council on Foreign Relations that lays out these realities, the structural, fiscal, political, et cetera, and where the gaps are. And I think what you're pointing to is the timeline is a real problem because European defense industry is atrophied. The things that the Europeans most need are not necessarily guys with guns, as important as they are, but lift, logistics, C4ISR, long-range munitions, air defense. But those are exactly the things that are most needed in the Pacific and are most difficult to reconstitute. And now with all the support for Ukraine, we're even deeper in the hole. Whatever one thinks about the merits of doing that, I think it's indisputable that we're deeper in the hole than we were before. So I think, unfortunately, we're going to go through a period of vulnerability. It appears the assessment is that the Russian military may take a couple of years to build up to where it could directly threaten NATO. That's what a lot of the NATO people are saying. I personally am not confident about that because if you're China and you're going to go after Taiwan, why wouldn't you invite Putin to also go against NATO in some capacity, or North Korea to go against South Korea, or Iran to expand the conflict in the Middle East? Simultaneous conflicts are your best bet, which is why a big part of why China is doing what it's doing in Europe. China doesn't actually think that what's happening in Ukraine is going to determine the fate of Taiwan, because if they did think that, they'd be intervening in the conflict. Instead, what they're doing is bleeding us out slowly and trying to get us focused on the other theater and depleting our resources. So I think we need to be prepared. I think there's going to be vulnerabilities, but the best way to manage the situation is to be practical and candid with our European allies and say, here's what we can provide, and this is what I've said to the Europeans, is we are going to have to withhold some of these key capabilities, even if Russia goes first, because if we commit those forces to Europe and they're degraded or lost or tied down, in a sense, China would be crazy not to go because that's the best possible opportunity, and that doesn't make any sense. So I believe that we can manage this period of vulnerability together if we're super real and practical, and that's where I'm hoping that frankly, I think there's going to need to be a change in our fundamental policy here in Washington, D.C. for this to really move forward, although you can see green shoots happening in Europe already.
Yeah, there's no question, I think, that we're in a period of unprecedented risk. I hope that's the focus of the conversations at the Alliance this week. But it's unclear that the political will is manifest there to make the decision. We got to a precipitous decline. Is it possible for us to reverse that trend? It's difficult. But again, to get to now the political will question, in your judgment, is it likely to manifest itself? And what are the political obstacles to get to our European and collective NATO partners to recommit to the defense in the alliance?
Yeah, that's a great question and a critically important question. And I think that to some extent, the war in Ukraine has been a big wake-up call for most countries in Europe, but not for all. And I think that the savagery and barbarism that we've seen from the Russians against Ukraine. Yesterday is a perfect example. A Russian missile struck a children's hospital in Kyiv, and this is what the Russian regime is capable of, and we mustn't underestimate what the Russians would do if they swept through the Baltic states, into Poland, into Western Europe, to Germany, what they're capable of doing, and what they would do. And I think that for the first time in many decades, the German government, for example, has really woken up to the reality. And so the Germans are starting to rearm, but not enough. Germany should be spending 4, 5%, 6% of GDP on defense. They are trying to get to, or they've just about got to 2% of GDP. That should be tripled, really, after decades of underinvestment. The threat from Russia is incredibly real. You look at governments such as the Spanish government, the socialist government in Spain, absolutely hopeless on NATO issues, hopeless on defense spending. And so you've got a number of big governments in Europe that really are not very serious about what's going on in Ukraine. You've got other governments who clearly are doing a lot. The Poles have been, of course, outstandingly good for several years. The Baltic states, a lot of the Central and Eastern European countries have really been stepping up to the plate. But some of the big powers in Western Europe still have an outdated, complacent mindset that has to really change. I'm also concerned about the development of this EU defense identity. Emmanuel Macron's calls for a European Union army. This is music to the ears of Putin. Putin would love to see a Europe divided, or a NATO alliance split between sort of Euro-federalists and those who are more skeptical. He would love to see the creation of a paper tiger European Union army that couldn't really do anything at all. He wants to see NATO split down the middle. He wants to see NATO weakened. And figures like Macron and multiple sort of Euro-federalist politicians in Europe are pushing this agenda of creating some kind of EU army, which would be absolutely destructive for the future of Europe, for the future of NATO. I do hope that if a second Trump administration comes in, that they will make it a priority to stand up to this idea of an EU defense identity, and the focus has to be upon strengthening the defenses of European nation states. And the European Union is increasingly, I think, a basket case, frankly. It's in a steep state of decline, and Putin would want nothing more than to see NATO resources taken by some kind of politicized European Union army. So let's fight against that. The United States has to stand shoulder to shoulder with key European partners against that idea. And I think that what Macron is proposing here is absolutely poison for the future of Europe, and the US has to stand up to that.
Well, certainly, I think that's been the trajectory. It's not the first time I think we've heard proposals of that sort. And to your point about Germany's response to Russian aggression, we're reminded this is a team sport. Not all countries are responding equally to the threat. Some of that's proximity-based. Some of that is just an accurate, sober assessment of the circumstances. So, Wilson, who's doing well? Who's not doing well? And what do you think the likely trajectory is that we can get everybody in the alliance to start pulling their own weight?
Well, firstly, there's a tendency in defense circles to evaluate Europe as a whole. People want to either say Europe is stepping up or Europe's not doing anywhere near enough. I think it's a lot more fair to say that some countries in Europe have absolutely stepped up and really responded in a big way to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and others have not. In the broadest terms, Scandinavia, the Baltic states, and Poland have all stepped up in a big way and are punching above their weight. Germany, somewhere in between, they've responded, absolutely. They still deserve some criticism for having taken a hiatus from defense spending for the past 3 decades, but it's very clear that the Zeitenwende is moving in the right direction and that Germans are taking their defense more seriously than they have in the past, and they deserve credit for that. At the same time, Western and Southern Europe really are not doing enough. In terms of Ukraine aid, very lackluster. There's also a sense of focusing on rhetoric over actual contributions. So a lot of people will condemn the Germans and praise the French. They'll say the Germans are, far too reticent. They're far too cautious. Look at Macron. He's, saying all the right things on Ukraine. Okay, well, Germany has given $11 billion in military aid to Ukraine, the second highest contributor after the United States, and France has given less than $2 billion. Exactly. That's way below much smaller countries like Denmark. Denmark has given $6 billion. So it's not an even comparison, and I think capabilities and actions matter a lot more than rhetoric. I will say that there's things other countries could do. If Italy, Spain, and France, for example, are not going to step up in a big way in Ukraine, maybe they could take the lead in stopping attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, on stopping the Houthis. The United States should be a lot more comfortable with our European partners taking initiative on things like this. We should encourage it and let countries play to their strengths as well.
So this will be my final question for panelists. So both online and in the room, time to formulate your own. For all three, same question. We'll start with Bridge, then we'll go to Wilson and finish with Niall. What's your practical assessment, to get back to Bridge's point, and it's time to talk practical necessity and the urgency of the circumstances. What's your judgment on Europe's performance in response to the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the American response?
Well, I think I look at it overall from the American point of view. I think we've been over-invested in Ukraine. I think I think it's perfectly legitimate, and I think it was right to provide some level of support to Ukraine. But I think the degree of support has been inconsistent with our own needs and the fact that we're behind the curve in the primary theater. And I think what has happened, unfortunately, is there's been a reversion to this old mean of the U.S. basically being the super dominant power and everybody kind of falling in line. And then, the fundamental, I think that wouldn't make a lot of sense under any circumstances, but it's particularly bizarre when this administration is not even increasing defense spending, right? I mean, the budget deal, et cetera, and it's below the rate of inflation. And then pretends that it's like, oh, Europe and Asia are all one theater, which is, it's literally obviously false. It's not like Europe and Asia have gotten closer together. I mean, and missiles still fly a certain distance, and you still need gas to power airplanes and tanks and stuff. I mean, it's one of those kind of novel sounding things that's novel because it's kind of absurd, right? So I think this has been a major problem. And I mean, if you look at the record, I think President Trump is exactly right to say, look at the record of this administration where you have the largest war in Europe in 75 years. It's not going well. It's an attritional conflict. North Korea is making progress on its nuclear and missile capabilities that can hit the U.S. homeland, I think we have to assume. There's a war in the Middle East, largest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust, et cetera, all this going on. So I think it's basically fully out of whack. Matt Pottinger is a friend of mine. I disagree with him on a number of things, but I think Matt is right to say, well, the wealth of the allied countries is a lot greater, like it's a lot bigger than Russia. But the actual capability and the military industrial capacity is very, very different. And that's the world that so I think what we needed over the last couple of years in terms of your core question, Rob, was not going to the Munich Security Conference and saying, hey, Europe, don't worry, everything's fine, it's all back to the old way, whether that was Democrats or Republicans. What we should have been doing from the beginning is saying, look, we're going to help you out, but there are limits to what we can do. You really need to step up. We're giving you fair warning. And now it's 2.5 years into the war, and so, I mean, not to be self-referential, but there was this big Politico Die Welt article, and it said that I've been unnerving Europeans by saying that there are limits to what we can do. It's like, what's unnerving is the reality of the situation. And would you prefer a situation in which you didn't get told the reality, and then you were surprised when you were really vulnerable? I don't think that's being a good friend. So I think the policy now has not been successful, and we need to get super real. It's a practical, tractable problem where I think we see evidence of movement in the right direction, as Wilson says. The problem is we need faster and more focused and more concrete. Wilson?
The first thing that we have to recognize here is that there are absolutely trade-offs. The United States is currently still pretending like we can do everything everywhere all at once, but we're living in a world of hard choices. We built this large military in the 1980s. We severely cut military spending in the 1990s, and then we spent the past 20 years using a lot of what we built in the 80s in counterinsurgencies that failed in Iraq and Afghanistan. So now here we are, depleted of munitions and without enough ships to deter the Chinese in the Indo-Pacific. So what we need is ships, planes, munitions. That's what the United States should be spending on. The procurement of the weapon systems, the military equipment that we need to deter the Chinese, our primary challenge. So you look at military aid to Ukraine so far. This is our military aid allocations, but total spending has been $174 billion, if you count up all the supplementals. That's almost the budget of the US Army. The US Army's annual budget is $185 billion. And we're not increasing defense spending significantly. The administration's not pushing for some massive increase in defense. You look back at the 1980s, so $850 billion, right? That sounds like a lot, but it's roughly 3% of GDP. In the 1980s, we were spending 6 or 7% of GDP. In the 1950s and 60s, we were spending 10% of GDP on defense. So we're spending less now, but the US military is still being asked to do as much or more as it was during the Cold War. So the choices before us are either prioritize, choose what is most important to American security, or double or triple the defense budget.
Well, and can I forgive me, Niall, for just I think we have a choice. Hard choices and scarcity are the reality. We have a choice between being deliberate about the choices we make or having reality and choices foisted upon us, which will be a lot less palatable for us.
Absolutely. So we should prioritize ahead of time.
Right.
Make the choices ourselves. So I hope that we choose to prioritize the Indo-Pacific and that our European partners step up and provide the bulk of conventional deterrence in Europe, even as the United States continues to provide the nuclear deterrent and certain core capabilities that enable the alliance.
Niall?
Yes, as my co-panelists have pointed out, the United States, of course, has spent vast sums of money already in support of Ukraine. I mean, no other country has given anywhere near as much support as the US. And I do think, though, that the Biden administration has lacked any clear, coherent long-term strategy for Ukraine. I think overall Biden's foreign policy has been overall confused, often clueless, and at some stages disastrous, as we saw with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And I do think America's adversaries today are increasingly emboldened and aggressive, and they're no doubt delighted by all the scenes of President Biden increasingly out of his mind. And we'll have to see how he does this week at the NATO summit. But so many European allies of ours that we've spoken to have expressed deep concern about the lack of American leadership right now, and the Biden administration I think, has far too often projected indecision, weakness, confusion, and at the end of the day, the NATO alliance is growing stronger with increased defense spending as a result of the pressure that Donald Trump applied when he was president. And that's not because of the Biden administration or anything they've done. I do hope that if we see a new US administration, that pressure will be on our NATO allies will be doubled, tripled, even further, and the minimum 2% spend, GDP spend, should be increased to at least 3% or higher. I mean, no doubt that a new US administration will be pressing for a significantly higher level. And as for Europe's overall contribution on Ukraine, it's very mixed, as Wilson pointed out. The Germans actually have been surprisingly good. And I've been very critical of Germany for many years with regard to their approach towards NATO. But on Ukraine, they have really stepped up to the plate. And I think we need to recognize that. The French have been absolutely dismally poor on this, despite all the saber rattling from Emmanuel Macron, talking about sending French troops and so on to Ukraine. But you look at what the French have actually invested in support of Ukraine, it's way below the level of many far smaller countries in Europe. So the big difference between the rhetoric from Paris and what they're actually doing. And I think tremendous credit goes to the Baltic states for what they have done, and Poland, of course. And I think the British have been outstandingly good as well on the Ukraine front. And this is a war in Europe's own backyard. All European countries should be serious about what's happening there, and they need to be taking the lead in terms of support for Ukraine. And the stakes are very, very high here. But there are so many governments in Europe that haven't been serious about the situation, and we need to hold them to account on that.
I think stakes couldn't be higher. The situation certainly warrants immediate change in course. It was the proximity to the Soviet threat that I think ushered in historic defense spending that ultimately helped us prevail. Let's hope that this week be the start of a conversation to restore that. But I, like all of you, I think, I'm not confident that that's actually going to be the outcome. We'll open up then questions first to the room and then online. If I could ask that when you do, wait for the microphone to come to you, and we've got individuals that are prepared to do so, so please raise your hand. Second, please introduce yourself and your affiliation, and then keep your question as brief as possible so that we have time to accommodate as many as possible. We'll begin here, the lady in the second row.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Irina Krasnoshtan. I'm from Ukraine, from the civil society. My question is about Indo-Pacific and Ukraine. Basically, we are discussing it as if these are two different, unrelated tracks, but of course China is very closely watching what is happening in Ukraine. And basically, the more successful Russia is in Ukraine, the more incentive it gives to China to attack Taiwan. Do you agree with this? Could you elaborate on this linkage?
Bridge?
With respect for your very difficult situation and your sacrifice your people are making for their independence, I don't agree with that. I mean, I don't think that the Chinese are primarily looking at the Ukraine conflict as if they are like a sort of waiting to be instructed as to what the sort of norms of the international system are. I think the Chinese have their own ideas, and Xi Jinping has his own ideas about how power works. He clearly has his own ideas that are not going to be imposed on him by Tony Blinken or something like that. And I think the Chinese are behaving, unfortunately, as I fear they would, which is to maximize their relative and regional power, but basically by depleting U.S. resources and willpower and money in a distant theater to give themselves as much advantage as possible where it matters to them, which is the first island chain, and of course that's connected to our resolve. And I think the thought experiment that I would suggest in thinking about this is, if the Chinese actually thought that the future of Taiwan, which they manifestly care about more than essentially anybody, if they actually thought it was going to be settled in Ukraine, they would intervene directly, right? Because that's how they would solve the Taiwan question, which is not what they're not even providing overt lethal assistance to the Russians. I mean, there's debate about what exactly they're doing, but they could do a lot more, and they're not doing that, which instead, actually, it suggests to me that they are benefiting tremendously from the situation today, which is a steady kind of bleeding out of the Americans in this secondary theater. The way I think about the United States and China, and I think it's relevant to Ukraine, but also countries like South Korea and others, is the United States, the international system is effectively bipolar now. There's obviously other significant players, but basically the United States and China are far larger than anybody else. China's much larger economy than the Soviet Union ever was, as even Nick Burns, a very eloquent and I think effective ambassador on this point of the Biden administration in China. The U.S. and China are like two heavyweight boxers who can challenge each other at any time. We're not going to start a war with China, so we have to be prepared for the Chinese to challenge us at any point. We face a number of other very tough, very formidable light and middleweight boxers as well. But if we start a fight with one of those guys and we get really bloodied and bruised, the Chinese can challenge us at any time. And everybody will be worse off if we lose that heavyweight fight. So it's our responsibility, if we're going to be strategic, if we're going to be real about the situation, that we have to be prepared for that heavyweight fight at all times. And that's going to involve being more selective and prioritizing in other theaters.
An excellent question. Thanks for the response. We'll go to this side of the room, middle. Yes, sir.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Gabriel Bub. I'm a journalist from Germany for Table Briefings. My question would be, especially to you, Mr. Colby. You talked a lot about Germans and was a bit mixed signals that Germany is doing well. Do you think, first, that Germany should take a leading role in Europe if the French are not doing so good, as you were saying, maybe together with Poland or also with France? And if China would choose to attack Taiwan, do you think it would be right to stop support of Ukraine immediately? Thank you.
Well, so my own view is we have to actually calibrate support for Ukraine already, even in anticipation. So my view, and I've said this for some time, including in a piece in Time magazine last year, is that the United States should provide to the Ukrainians assets that are manifestly not useful for a first island chain scenario. So I stand by that position, and there are capabilities, maybe Abrams tanks, for instance, that could be given to the Ukrainians. But things like air defense, munitions, money, et cetera, which are much more scarce. I mean, Speaker Johnson, don't take it from me, Speaker Johnson said the number one threat to America's national security is the national debt. Now, he gave a speech at the Hudson Institute that was a little bit more expansive in its foreign policy aspirations, but when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, he did not call for significant increases in defense spending, and he said that the debt is the number one priority for the United States and that he would push for cuts in spending. So, realistically, I hope there will be more defense spending. I think that would be in order. But we're going to need more defense spending just to keep up with the Chinese, if we're able to do that, given they have 200 times the shipbuilding capacity we do, and our submarine industrial base is in terrible shape, our munitions industrial base is in bad shape, et cetera, et cetera. So that would be my answer on the Ukraine. I don't speak for anybody but myself, but that would be my recommendation that I've been consistently making. I think Germany absolutely must play a central role in European security. It's Germany's historic responsibility. We know Germany can do it because 10 years after the end of the Second World War, it built up the Bundeswehr as Wilson's written about, by 1985. It had 12 active divisions and 3 in ready reserve. That was a country that's 2/3 the size of the present Federal Republic. So obviously the Germans can do it if they put their mind to it. It's good the Germans have moved forward, but there's a bit too much self-congratulation right now because the Germans should actually be putting forces in the field in the very near term that can help defend the countries, by the way, that suffered during World War II and were under Soviet domination during the Cold War. So I think this is a special, and I think it's been very telling that Chancellor Scholz, who felt that it was appropriate to effectively endorse President Biden in his interview with Axel Springer around the G7, has just rejected Minister Pistorius's pretty modest request for additional funding to fulfill the Zeitenwende. I mean, that raises real questions. I think President Biden should be reading Chancellor Scholz the Riot Act if he has American and European interests at heart.
And I would point out that we're not choosing Germany randomly. It's the biggest population, the biggest economy in Europe, and any successful European deterrence of Russia will include a much larger German military. That's why the analysis and the criticism is focused on Germany, because it's critical.
No.
Yeah, just to add to the excellent points made here. I mean, Germany's role is so crucially important at the heart of Europe, and while I think the Germans, or this government has been good on Ukraine, it has sent a lot of overall mixed signals with regard to China, the future relationship with Russia. Scholz, in my view, has overall been a very weak chancellor. And if we see a change of government in Germany next year, Germany has got to play a stronger role in a positive way internationally. And Germany, of course, has the biggest economy in Europe, but it doesn't necessarily act as a big player on the world stage. And clearly you can't do that. If you're only going to spend 2% of GDP on defense, you're going to be a far weaker force on the international stage. So we do need to see more positive German leadership, especially standing up to Russia, China, also to Iran as well. And Germany has been very weak, I think, in terms of standing up to the Iranian regime in the last couple of decades, and of course huge German financial interests in Iran. And Germany's got to really change its mindset in terms of standing up to what is an immense threat now, not only to the Middle East, but also to Europe as well, in the form of the Iranian Islamist regime. It's a terrorist dictatorship. And all European governments have got to stand up to Iran. And we've not seen enough strength being demonstrated by the German government on this issue.
We'll go to the gentleman in the back on the right-hand side.
Yes, my name is Roger Cochetti, and I'm a retired executive at the State Department, ComSat, IBM, VeriSign, doing international business. And what I have is really what I think is the $64 trillion question. And I'll illustrate it by just giving a little bit of history. When I was a student at the Foreign Service School at Georgetown and Johns Hopkins SAIS, I was taught by many professors that the reason the United States had to entirely subsidize European defense was that if we did not, then they could not have 6 weeks of vacation, retirement at 55, free education, free medical care. And if the average person in Greece or Italy or France or Holland were asked, would you rather have a military defense that's capable of defending Europe, or no free health care, no free education, blah, 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 the average person would immediately say, well, let's just be a gigantic Yugoslavia, and I get all the goodies. So the $64 trillion question is, how do the Europeans actually pay for all this without having 1 week of vacation a year and to pay for health care and pay for education and retire at 67? Or do they try to just quintuple their taxes and drive business out of Europe? I think the average European is worried about who's going to pay for this, and the U.S. subsidy has permitted them to what many American leaders said is, so they don't vote communist, so they don't vote socialist, so they don't, so the subsidy is necessary, in this theory, necessary part of the fabric. How do you deal with a $64 trillion question? Who's going to pay for it?
Well, Niall asked Niall to field the question first, but let me preface what we mentioned up front, that in addition to the entitlement spending that you mentioned, climate also features prominently. If you look at budgets and you look and assess what the priorities are, in 2023, European Union nations spent $320 billion on climate-related initiatives. By their own accounting, and only $240 billion on defense spending. So show me your budget, I'll show you your priorities. So it's more than just entitlements. But now, how do you answer the $64 trillion
that's
question?
actually a really good question, and it's such an important issue to discuss here, because the United States should not be subsidizing vast welfare systems in Europe. The U.S. taxpayer shouldn't be paying for 6 weeks holiday for Western Europeans, or early retirement, or 35-hour working week. The reality is, Europeans have got to work harder. Their governments need to spend less. They need to reduce the huge welfare systems that are in place. They've got to secure their borders. Mass migration is a huge drain, frankly, on European economies. And we're seeing that France, Germany, Belgium, Austria, Netherlands, UK. It's very expensive when you take in millions upon millions of asylum seekers, refugees, economic migrants. It's very expensive. And so I think the era of the United States subsidizing European welfare states should be over. And we shouldn't be paying for Jean-Luc Mélenchon's plans to spend 200 billion extra euros on vast social welfare projects in France. The US has to be very tough in its messaging here. And the our European allies need to wake up here. They can't sustain these vast, huge, expensive welfare systems. They've got to adopt economic freedom instead of big government. And the EU, I think, is in a tremendous state of decline, in large part because of its vast, bloated spending levels, vast bureaucracies, and an addiction to huge welfare systems. So this has to end.
Turn the question around and look at it from the American perspective. Remember that the American defense budget and aid to Europe, aid to Ukraine, that's all based on the political will of the American people. That Congress has to be able to support it and has to have a voting base that supports American military action internationally. And if European governments are not substantially spending on their own defense, it's going to be a really hard sell to the American people that we should be substantially involved in Europe, underwriting their defense, when we only get 5 or 6 days of vacation a year.
We'll go to an online question, and then we'll have one more for in the room. So microphone down here.
Thank you. An online question. What actions can the U.S. take to move France to better contribute to NATO?
Now, do you want to start us off?
Yes, that's another really good question. France is going completely in the wrong direction right now, and you really need a fundamental change of government in France. I mean, I think you need real conservative leadership in France, and the direction it's taking now towards socialism, communism, hostility towards the United States and the transatlantic alliance. This is extremely dangerous, and I'm very worried about the future of France. I mean, it's a country that has huge problems, immense levels of public debt, rising lawlessness, social disorder. It is, I think, symbolic of all of the major problems that Europe as a continent is facing today. But I don't think that France can really be an effective, strong player within NATO if it is going to be taken over by the left, actually. And Macron has played along with all of this, actually. I mean, he's struck a deal with the far left ahead of this election. And I think France is going to be paying the penalty for it. And Macron will be a lame duck president until 2027, until the presidential elections. But I do see France right now in an almost terminal state of decline. It's got to sort itself out, but it's moving completely. The train's moving in the wrong direction. So let's see if France can move in the other direction, a few years from now. But right now, I think France is in a really perilous state.
Well, I was going to say, I want to pick up on what you're saying, Niall, but also what, Rob, you said, show me your budget, and that'll show me your priorities. And I think, Wilson, you said something, same effect. And there's maybe a more colloquial phrase, which is, money talks, and as Biden would say, malarkey takes a walk, or something to that effect. But, getting back to the welfare state question, which will connect to the French question, is, we're in a look. One of the reasons that I don't take the Europeans always as seriously as they suggest is, like, if the situation were so grave, they would be spending a lot more money. Like the Poles, I take very seriously because they're going to get to 5%. Oh, so they're actually serious. But if the German government is actually not giving Pistorius what he needs, if the former British government, when the chief of army, going off the threat reports about Russia, said they might have to consider conscription, shot down the chief of army, well, you know what? Maybe it's not as serious as they say. I personally take at face value that Russia will be a threat and look at their behavior. But I think the most important thing that Americans are going to need to see is that Europeans are actually putting skin in the game. And at the end of the day, if the Europeans decide to go on the, prefer all these welfare states, and I don't exactly know what that's their prerogative to do what they want to do. I'm sympathetic to what Niall's saying. But I think we have every right to say, oh, well, actually, when people are saying President Trump is going to be the end of the republic, but actually they're not spending more really on defense, and a lot of it's moving money around and pensions and so forth, time out, like that's, and what we don't need, and I think what President Macron, as you were saying, Wilson, this idea of making grandiose statements and potentially putting French forces into Ukraine and talking openly about escalating the war, and then actually, similarly, David Cameron putting very modest support for the Ukrainians. It's kind of like, I call it like a peacock security policy. It's like a lot of flapping of wings and so forth, but not a lot behind it. I think we should be seeing the exact opposite, which is practical, and I think people like Pistorius and Healy and Lamy and so forth are a potential way forward. But that's what I would prefer to see from our European friends and partners, and I think what the Americans should be prepared to do is accommodate how the Europeans want to go about doing that. So I'm a little bit different view on, for instance, the European Union. If the Europeans want to run some of these things to the European Union, I think NATO is very, very important and makes a lot of sense. But let's work with the Europeans where they are and where it's going to be most effective for them to do so. But we have to see real skin in the game for that to work.
I appreciate it. We're running out of time, and so what I'll do is ask our panelists to provide brief closing remarks and thoughts that they'd like to leave with you, and then we'll bring it to a close. Now we'll begin with you, sir.
Yeah, thanks very much, Robin. It's been a really great discussion today. And some closing thoughts. I think Europe's really got to wake up to the level of the threat that all European countries are facing right now, from Russia, from China, from Iran, also internally from Islamist militants. I think the rise of the Islamist threat within European countries is incredibly dangerous for the future of Europe, and Europe's got to be serious about that. I do think that Europe's success in the future rests upon sovereignty and self-determination rather than some grand supranational European project, which I think will collapse eventually. And Europe's future success as well rests upon economic freedom, economic liberty, but also a strong transatlantic alliance with the United States. And I think that's the best way forward.
Thanks, now, Wilson.
I would just say very briefly that some European countries are taking their defense seriously and others are not. But that if I were from any European state, I would be building up my defense budget, building real military capability, because I see that the United States is faced by the necessity of pivoting resources and assets to the Pacific.
Yeah, I'll just say, again, it's been an honor to be on here at Heritage with this great panel. I would just say I think President Trump is absolutely right to say that we're on the verge of World War III. I don't think that's an exaggeration, and I think the right way out of that is peace through strength. We're here at Heritage, but that's both strength, but also peace, the ability and willingness to come to some kind of modus vivendi, even with our hostile enemies and rivals and so forth. You need strength for that, but I also think right now we're on this terrible course where there's a huge war and the possibility for things to get even worse. World War III, not only for World War III to break out, which would be horrible enough, but the possibility that we might lose it. And so I think we fundamentally need a change of course. I think core to that is a much more realistic and candid and practical approach to transatlantic security that's a more balanced one. And don't let people fool you that that's a violation or a betrayal of NATO's legacy. That goes back, and that's why I quibble with the title a little bit. Maybe that would be our great-grandfathers. That's what Dwight Eisenhower had in mind. That's sensible. That's something that can work on both sides that's going to have political, fiscal, military, and strategic sustainability. So there is a way forward, but we need fundamental change soon.
I appreciate all of your attendance today. I hope you'll have time to download products and our research on this subject. Our hope is that the NATO summit takes the conversation we had today seriously, but they may well not. And in the end of the day, the threat is pressing and real, and the commitment is historic and is required. Let me invite all of you to thank the members of our panel today for their contributions and for their wisdom. Thanks very much and have a great day.